So as you heard, the title of my talk is Why We Should Care About Neuroscience. And this is a question that's familiar to me because part of my job is to teach neuroscience to psychiatry residents. And this is a question that they often ask. Now, I care about neuroscience because I think it's an interesting thing to study, because I think the brain is a fascinating organ, and from a basic science standpoint, I think we should care about it. But the residents in psychiatry want to learn practical things. They're like residents in all other medical specialties. They want to learn things that will help them treat their patients. And they're raring to go to see patients and apply the knowledge that they're learning. So they often are not convinced that they should be learning about neuroscience. So usually when people try to justify this to them, they say that neuroscience will help them to understand the disorders that they're treating or will lead to new treatments. And the problem with this argument is that really we don't know the cause of any of the psychiatric disorders that we commonly treat. We don't know what causes schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, or anxiety disorders. And none of the treatments that we use today, whether the psychotherapies or the medications, really came from basic neuroscience discoveries. So when psychiatry residents learn about neuroscience, they often get, I think, an unsatisfying list of abnormalities and biomarkers that are associated with different disorders, and some theories, some hypotheses about what the cause or the pathophysiology of these disorders is. But it doesn't really hang together. And so I think they're not really convinced. So my argument would be that actually neuroscience is important for some quite different reasons. And I think neuroscience in particular can help us to understand things about behavior and emotion in our patients that really have nothing to do with a specific disorder. That although we might not really know the neurobiology of schizophrenia or depression, we actually know quite a bit about the neurobiology of anger, of aggression, of love and fear. And it is these kinds of basic behaviors that often cause patients distress and lead them to come to see a psychiatrist. And these are also the kinds of behaviors that I think neurobiology can tell us a lot about. Another reason why I think neuroscience is important is because a lot of these behaviors that I've just mentioned are the subject of a lot of rules, social, political, legal rules. And I think that knowing more about human nature, and especially about behavior, might help us to design social systems and societies in a way that is more suited to the way human nature really is, rather than the way we think it should be. And of course, this mismatch sometimes between how patients feel and how they think they should feel, what's expected of them, is also a major source of distress. So as an example, I want to talk about the neuroscience of love, but maybe more precisely, the neurobiology of pair bonding and attachment and monogamy. And I want to talk about this because I think this is a good example, because these kinds of behaviors, our intimate relationships, who we love, what kind of sex we have, and what kinds of responsibilities and obligations we have to people in these relationships, these kinds of behaviors are really subject to a lot of social rules. All of us are aware of the same-sex marriage debate in the United States, and in some ways I'm surprised that this debate includes all kinds of religious and political, social, and moral perspectives, but really not much about biology, even though what we're talking about here is, I think most people would agree, one of the most basic biological behaviors. So I want to tell you a bit about what is known about pair bonding and monogamy, and a lot of this knowledge comes from the work of Larry Young at Emory and Tom Insel at NIH, but of course it involves the work of a lot of people. Now, a lot of what we know about pair bonding and monogamy comes from a species called the vole. So it's a bit of an unusual model organism. Usually we study rats or mice, but voles are rodents too. They're sort of cute, furry little rodents that are maybe halfway between a gopher and a squirrel without the tail. And voles come in over 100 different species. And what makes them really useful for studying pair bonding and monogamy is that there's one particular species, a prairie vole, that shows very strong monogamous pair bonding behavior, and it's different than all the other vole species. And so by monogamy in a vole, what we mean is that if you let a prairie vole couple mate, a male and a female prairie vole, then after that they'll develop a strong preference for each other. So if you let them spend time with any other voles, they will choose preferentially to spend time with each other. And they'll also develop a kind of territoriality and become aggressive and defend this territory against intruders, especially strangers. So it turns out that in the male and the female prairie vole, there are two fairly simple neurotransmitter systems that control monogamous pair bonding. And in the male prairie vole, it's the vasopressin hormone and the V1A receptor, the vasopressin 1A receptor. And in female voles, it's the oxytocin system. So if you put a male and a female prairie vole together and you let them mate, if you give the male prairie vole a drug that blocks the V1A receptor, or the female vole a drug that blocks the oxytocin receptor, the voles will act as if they didn't mate. They won't develop this partner preference, and they won't be aggressive towards intruders. On the other hand, if you put them in a cage together, but you don't let them mate, but you give the male a drug that activates the vasopressin V1A receptor, like vasopressin, or you give the female vole oxytocin, then they will act as if they've mated. They'll form a pair bond, and they will act just as if they actually mated. So people have sort of refined this basic experiment, and in fact have used things like viral vectors to alter the expression of these receptors in different parts of the brain. And they can actually take a vole species that's not naturally monogamous, and by increasing the expression of one of these receptor systems in reward centers in the brain, they can actually change a non-monogamous vole species into, in this behavior, into very much like a prairie vole. So I think the conclusion of these experiments is that the V1A and the oxytocin receptors really are necessary and sufficient for driving monogamous pair bonding in voles, at least. So people, of course, were interested to see what these receptor systems do in humans. And of course, humans have the same genes, and like the rest of the human genome, these genetic sequences in humans are variable. They're polymorphic, and they come in different versions. And some of these variants, some of these alleles, are associated with some behaviors that are relevant to the behaviors in voles. In fact, they're very similar. So if you look at variants in the V1A receptor in humans, some of them are related to the likelihood that someone's going to be married, the likelihood that someone might get divorced after they're married. It also is related to the quality of their relationships with their significant other, and also how satisfied they are with these kinds of relationships. So now you might say, why is this information useful? I think we already all know that there's a variation in this kind of behavior among humans, that humans are not all the same. Well, I think why this is important is because it doesn't just highlight the fact that we're different, but it gives us some understanding of the mechanism by which we differ. And the fact that humans have a range of behavior as a species on this particular dimension, I think is an example of a wider phenomena. Among the voles, variation in these receptor systems and variation in the behavior is segregated by species. So the prairie vole shows monogamous mating behavior, but the other vole species don't. But within our species, there's a range of variation. And some people, like Steve Swomey, also at NIH, argue that this kind of behavioral diversity is what gives us, as a species, an advantage. We're not a specialized species. We can't run as fast as a cheetah. We can't see as well as an eagle. We can't smell as well as a dog. So we really can't compete with any other species on a particular skill or ability. But of course, what we can do much better than any other species is choose from a wide repertoire of behavioral responses. And that's why we can adapt so well to the environment, and that's why we are so successful almost everywhere on the planet. So, but again, one could say, how does knowing the mechanism driving these kinds of behaviors, how is that useful? And I think it's important for a few reasons. The first one is that I think it's not enough just to observe differences in behavior, but I think understanding the mechanism is important. And although I can't exactly say why, I guess the analogy would be that I feel more comfortable flying in a plane with a pilot who understands aerodynamics. Even though, theoretically, a 12-year-old can learn Flight Simulator and land a 747 in an ice storm, I want my pilot to have a bit more depth and understanding of what those controls are doing. So I think it's good to go beyond just input-output relationships to understand our patients. And so I think the main reason why this kind of understanding is useful is because it allows us to see the diversity in our patients' behavior with some tolerance, maybe to have more humanity in understanding their behaviors, and maybe also to give them some hope that they're not necessarily different than everyone else, that if they're distressed because their behaviors don't match with what's expected of them, that maybe they have some way of understanding that. And I also hope that understanding this kind of element of our behavior might help us to design better societies, better legal systems, better institutions that are matched to the way that human nature really is, rather than having some abstract notion of the way that we should be and hoping that people will fit into that. And that's why I think we should care about neuroscience.